A Chinese newspaper published a puzzling article last year, undermining the authenticity of Korea's iconic kimchi. When the International Organization for Standardization certified the process of making pao chai, a different pickled vegetable dish from China's Sichuan region, the Swiss-based organization clearly stated the standard does not apply to kimchi, which is widely known and loved around the world as a spicy pickled dish quintessential to Korean history and culture. However, Beijing's Global Times newspaper claimed that the accreditation was an international standard for the kimchi industry led by China. While Seoul's agricultural ministry, along with global media and cultural experts, were quick to point out the inaccuracy of this claim, the report did trigger a bitter spat between Korean and Chinese social media users that continued into the new year. In January, a Chinese vlogger posted a kimchi making video, but hashtagged it as Chinese cuisine and Chinese food, stirring further upset and angry comments in Korea. Then when a South Korean YouTuber in Korea said that kimchi originates from Korea, she faced online harassment and had a contract cancelled in China. This so-called kimchi war appears to be the latest in a series of online clashes provoked by arbitrary claims from Chinese internet users and certain media over key cultural aspects that are indisputably Korean. So what's driving these unsubstantiated claims and what purpose are they serving? To address these questions, we connect with David Mason, Professor of Korean Cultural Tourism at Sejong University. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We're also joined by journalist Stephen Borrowick, contributing writer for Nikkei Asia based in Seoul. It's lovely to see you as well. Thank you for joining the show.
My pleasure, thank you.
Well, let's start with you, David, first of all, by clarifying what makes kimchi distinctly Korean and how the art of making kimchi is now being enjoyed around the world, to the point of being recognized by UNESCO as an intangible asset.
Well, yes, the kimjang practice of every November of making the kimchi for the whole family, that's a UNESCO intangible world cultural heritage now. That was recognized 7 years ago, or 8. So I think kimchi is very well known, and it's very well known as Korean. It was often said 20 years ago that the only 2 Korean words that, besides proper nouns, that are not in the that are in the international dictionaries, kimchi and taekwondo. Those 2 words had made it into the dictionaries quite a while ago, and it's, I think, a very well recognized cultural asset of Korea, part of its food. As Korean foods become well known, kimchi is the best known, right alongside of beef barbecues of several kinds.
And it's been recorded throughout history as well, hasn't it, David?
Yes, certainly. Records of pickle making, pickled vegetables, seem to go back to the Three Kingdoms era. There are some mentions in old records, and certainly by the Goryeo dynasty we have written records, and we know that the kimjang factor after the harvest, that in late autumn people were doing the kimchi making, and that it was an important part of society and family life, and the transmission of kimchi making from a mother-in-law to her daughter-in-law as an interesting social process, and not directly to her daughters usually, but teaching the daughter-in-law how her new husband likes his kimchi, or what kimchi he's accustomed to, that is an important social aspect. And certainly by the Joseon dynasty, we have extensive records of how kimchi evolved kind of century by century, and the introduction of hot red peppers that made quite a big difference, and the introduction of what we call Napa cabbage or Chinese cabbage, becoming a principal item of kimchi rather than the radish. All that is very well documented, accepted by UNESCO, and I would say known as much as any aspect of Korean historical culture is known.
Right, so very well recorded, and of course, it's not just consumed, but it's considered as a core part of the Korean identity as well, this social element of making kimchi. And well, Stephen, now it seems that certain Chinese media have been fueling claims over Korean cultural products, including, of course, over kimchi. What do you make of the sort of language that they've been using? For instance, claiming that the certification of Pao Chai marks the recognition of a global standard for the kimchi industry, saying it's being led by China, and then responding to criticism over this claim by saying that perhaps South Korea feels insecure about its cultural heritage. What do you make of these claims?
Well, I can only speculate about their motivation. The specific claim about China leading the kimchi industry, I wonder if part of that was motivated by the fact that China actually has a lot of factories that produce kimchi. A lot of the kimchi that's consumed in Korea is actually produced in China. As we all know, China has cheaper labor costs than Korea does, and they can produce all kinds of items from manufactured goods to food items at a much lower cost than most anywhere else. I can only speculate as to why the Chinese state media's motivation for wanting to claim that China is some kind of global leader in kimchi. I think what kind of irked Korean netizens is that such a claim, if they wanted to make the claim on strictly an industrial basis, it might have been different if the state media had also included some kind of acknowledgement that kimchi is a Korean cultural good, and that is just a specific point that a lot of it happens to be produced in China, but there was no acknowledgement of that. And you alluded earlier to some of these Chinese bloggers and the social media discussion that was kind of implying that kimchi was a Chinese good, when in fact, as Professor Mason just laid out, it's a well-established part of Korean culture. So I don't know exactly why they did that, and specifically when it comes to implying that Koreans are somehow sort of sensitive or insecure. I'm not going to delve too far into that because again, I don't know the motivations of the Korean netizens who were speaking out about this, but I think the whole situation probably could have been avoided if China had just clearly the state media articles had just laid out that the Sichuanese cuisine is distinct from Korean cuisine. These are two different things, and they're both pickled vegetables. They have some things in common, but a simple acknowledgement that kimchi is a uniquely Korean food item, I think, could have gone a long way.
Mm. Well, David, there was also an online dispute over Korean traditional dress called hanbok, when the Chinese drama featured costumes closely resembling the outfit, but then its producer claimed that it was Chinese. And then, of course, Chinese also listed Korea's folk song Arirang, the namesake of this channel, as one of its intangible cultural assets. And recently, there was even online content claiming that figure skater Kim Yeona and footballer Son Heung-min are ethnically Chinese. And of course, when South Koreans online voiced their displeasure at these kind of developments, Beijing state media suggested that South Koreans aren't confident about their own culture. But don't these claims suggest that perhaps the opposite is true? I mean, imitating another culture could perhaps be seen as a sincere form of flattery, but why claim it as your own?
Well, I think one major factor we have to recognize that while Korea famously is one ethnic group in a nation, China's an empire, and it contains, I think officially 57 or 58 or something ethnic groups in it. And Koreans are something, last I heard, the number 7 biggest ethnic group in China. So technically, all these 57 ethnicities of China are part of Chinese culture, and that means the millions of Koreans who live in China and they sing Arirang and they make kimchi and they wear hanbok on holidays and other things. I mean, that is one ethnic part of China. The same way, like Jeju-do has some distinct ethnic characteristics within Korea that are considered part of overall Korean culture, the specific things about Jeju. So that's true. And the other big factor here is just recognizing that anybody can say anything online, and one writer writing in the Global Times, they don't really have much editorial responsibility there. that's just one writer saying what they want to say. And in China these days, in particular, there's no reward at all for being global-minded and complimenting other countries, and there's no danger at all of being too nationalistic, too ultra-nationalistic and claiming false things for China, but in fact those are rewarded. That's how you get a promotion, you get advancement, you get lots of public approval on the internet by very ultra-nationalist claims. And there's no penalty for it at all, certainly. So you just have to recognize that atmosphere and don't overreact to every rather random kind of ridiculous claim that somebody may say in China.
Yeah,
and that applies.
Another sort of random claim that came up, random content that came up rather, as Stephen, was K-pop group BTS being slammed by Chinese media for mentioning how Korean and US soldiers had suffered tragedies in the Korean War. And do you think Beijing is perhaps feeling threatened by the influx or popularity of K-pop? And do you think these recent claims on Korean cultural content or assets, do you think this is really helping China's international image or hurting it?
I think when it comes to BTS and Parasite specifically, there are a lot of countries that are, I think, curious as to why Korean culture has been able to capture the global imagination in such a powerful way. For a foreign language movie to win Oscars and to have the success that Parasite did, and for a group singing in Korean to become like the biggest pop group in the world, I think has led to just a lot of wonderment and a lot of analysis as to why these particular cultural phenomenons have been so successful, specifically successful with Westerners. So I think China is among the countries that's watching the explosion of Korean popular culture with, and kind of wondering why Chinese popular culture has not been able to capture the global imagination in quite the same way. I'd like to underscore, as to your question about China's image, I'd like to refer to David's claim about it maybe not being best to overreact and to take such claims so seriously. When anyone gets upset about a baseless claim as like China is being the originator of kimchi or Song Hun-min being ethnically Korean, you do lend a kind of legitimacy if you get upset. I wonder if it's better to just ignore such claims. I think China's probably not doing. We got to be careful with this. Something that comes from netizens and something that comes from the government. I think this is not like the Chinese government's official position, but to make such claims like that, I don't think are really good for anyone. I don't think anyone comes out looking good if you make a baseless claim like that. That's like on its face intended to be a kind of cultural triumph and say that something belongs to your country. It all comes across as kind of unnecessary, I think.
And Stephen, well, the Global Times, it actually seemed to be backing away from the initially provocative stance it held, as its article last week suddenly emphasized that the online feud doesn't represent the reality of Seoul-Beijing relations, and then it emphasized the importance of cooperation in the era of Joe Biden's presidency in the US. And then, of course, the article went on to suggest that perhaps Korean netizens had triggered the conflict by misinterpreting China's ISO certification when, of course, the newspaper had triggered this initial feud. What do you make of this change in narrative?
Well, as someone who works in media, I would point to how it can be kind of tricky to interpret something that comes out of state media in an authoritarian country like China. The government will often not communicate its positions in a really clear and decisive way. It will use these state outlets to put forth its position on something. And the convenient part about that is it gives the governments an easy way to then later sort of deny or to downplay something, and to say that, well, that was not the official government position. That's just the position of this media outlet, when everybody knows that these media outlets don't operate with, what we as Westerners would recognize as editorial independence. I wonder, again, I can only speculate as to the writers of that article, what they were trying to accomplish. I wonder if that was motivated by a perception that things had kind of gotten out of hand, and that, as you mentioned, with the Biden administration taking office in the US, that now is a kind of period where there's an opportunity for a reset of relations, and China may be interested in having warmer relationships with South Korea with the Biden administration, and kind of seeking to bring South Korea more into its sphere of influence, and being a little nervous as to whether or not the Moon administration might be trying to further strengthen the alliance with the U.S. But over the next few months, we'll see. It'll be an interesting time to see just what shape this takes and how the diplomatic element of it plays out. And hopefully Kimchi will not complicate global diplomacy any more than it already has.
Right. Hopefully, well, this online feud will die down and we'll see a way forward from this. But, well, I'm afraid this is where we're going to have to leave the discussion for today as we're out of time. But that was David Mason, Professor of Korea Cultural Tourism at Sejong University, and Stephen Borek, contributing writer for Nikkei Asia in Seoul. Thank you both so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Sure. Happy to give some help.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.